And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, brothers of the Serpent podcast. And just to put a lie to what I said about all music being created in-house, this was actually made by a fan of the show. He sent this in when we were doing, what was it? We were doing... I
don't remember.
We were doing
it's
one
called
of
the Texas Cobra Dance.
Yeah, we were doing one of the Egypt books. Chris Dunn's probably Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt or the Giza Power Plant or something.
There's only 2 donated songs that I've played on the podcast. This is one, and the other one was from Scotty Baldwin.
That's right.
Thank you, Scotty.
Yeah.
The old Xing Yang Serpent.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
So we've gone long on both of these segments, so maybe we'll just do one more long segment and be done. I think.
What?
That's how we'll do it. Because it's good, because this is just a long form conversation. But let's take the conversation now to, ancient aliens and that concept versus ancient civilization. So the way we look at this now, like, anyone who is probably has coming to this podcast and has an interest in this subject has probably heard of the ancient alien stuff. I mean, obviously there's the very popular History Channel television series, but the concept that, were some of these ancient civilizations and maybe these mysterious structures influenced by extraterrestrial contact. And that is a kind of an alluring idea at the beginning. And I don't totally discount the concept of paleo contact, the idea that ancient humans may have been contacted in some way by something non-human, whether that was actual flesh and blood extraterrestrials coming here in nuts and bolts craft or something more strange than that. I don't know how to put it, but there is this idea that when was the beginning of what we now think of as modern human thinking? And a lot of archaeology and anthropology puts it to either what they can see in art or burial practices, right? So there's 2 concepts here of what changed in the minds of hominids that began to make them conceive of things in such a way that they can then begin to create abstract art, imagery. And in some cases we're just talking about on cave walls, but it kind of looks sudden. Now that may be an artifact of preservation. But you have things like Chauvet Cave, which is in Europe, and I don't remember the exact date. Maybe the watcher can find out, but it's 30 to 40,000 years old. And it's
the art.
Yeah, the artwork in the cave. And it's absolutely beautiful. And I think there's the quote from, was it Picasso, who said, like, we have invented nothing.
Yeah.
He goes in there and sees it, and he's just like, wow, whoever did this was, in other words, modern art has invented nothing. These people, and that's an interesting encapsulation of
kind of the way we look at
well, and more broadly, what we see in a lot of ancient civilizations, the idea that Sumerians, which is which is pretty much the first accepted urban civilization, people who built cities, right? That Sumerians basically invented everything that we have now that we include in our civilization. The idea of like common laws, plumbing,
beer,
writing, beer, yeah, all that stuff. Well, I mean, there was beer before that, right? Didn't we have?
I think they invented this stuff.
Yeah. So Watcher's putting up running water, sanitation, terraced agriculture, like there's a huge list of things that the Sumerians, quote unquote, invented.
And writing.
Yeah. Writing is another one.
Agriculture.
Yeah.
But not true.
Well, that's the question. So Picasso is looking at this ancient artwork that's 40,000 years old and saying, we've invented nothing. In other words, I think that broadly is in the same thing. Like where you look at these very ancient civilizations and you say, well, other than maybe in mass execution, we have invented nothing, right? In other words, in the execution of the enormity of our civilization, that's the only difference, really. Some materials, right? And then later on, electricity and other advancements. But in terms of the basis and the basics of civilization, we didn't, it was invented
But I mean, yeah, you get into this
4,000 BC, it was invented. All
Yeah.
that stuff was invented. We've just been kind of like tinkering
You look
with
at like
it.
the Baghdad battery,
Right. Yeah.
and maybe they were using it to electroplate.
Right.
But the point is,
And they
were
use that as a dismissal. Well, it was for electroplation. You're like, okay, wait. They made batteries to electroplate stuff in 2000
the
BC.
point is that when you think about stuff like electricity and you're looking at ancient civilizations, well, I mean, we shock each other all the time without power plants.
Yeah.
And so the phenomenon of electricity is noticed by every person.
Yeah.
Now, it just takes a scientifically oriented mind, like in other words, I'm talking about
Did we
the
just lose the
process
washer?
of science.
I think he just bailed on us.
Oh, did he?
Oh no, I don't know. The window just closed. For some
Yeah,
reason.
it's been doing that.
Okay.
What I mean is the scientific method,
Yeah.
right? Which is this process of figuring things out. Process of elimination. There's all different types of or ways that you can approach the world scientifically, and it would just take somebody who's sort of oriented in that way to rule out things that are not true
Yeah.
as they're looking into something and be curious to start studying static electricity.
Yeah.
And I mean,
And if you have amber, you can generate
plenty
a good-
of things,
yeah.
silk and
amber, and you
cotton
can, yeah, that's
there's-
right. Yeah.
There's all kinds of materials that we've talked about this before, but the triboelectric series,
Right.
Any two materials that are far apart on this series,
Glass and silk. That's all you
Yeah.
need.
yeah, meaning that one wants to shed electrons, the other one wants to take them on,
Yeah.
and yeah, so this could be discovered. It just takes one person with an inquisitive mind
Yeah.
and a good process of weeding out things that are not true
Right.
to figure this out.
Yeah.
Of course, they need a lifestyle that's not running around in butt flap with a spear.
Yeah.
That gives them time, right, to
Yeah.
be able to dedicate themselves to looking into it.
Right.
And we see this type of activity in the 1900s. Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison doing this, looking into electricity, and the amount of discoveries these two guys made,
Yeah.
and of course, old Ben Franklin, you got to give him some credit.
Right. I mean, yeah, and there were early experiments with Laden jars, and I'm remembering that where you had the ball of glass, was it, and then they had the crank, and then
Yeah.
you hold the
cloth
on it or whatever, so the ball of glass is spinning with the crank, and you're holding a piece of silk on it, and it's building up static electricity, and then there's a metal chain that's dragging on the top of the ball, and that's connected to this Laden jar, which is basically a capacitor. And they would do this thing where they'd charge up the capacitor, in front of everybody, and then they would completely dismantle it very carefully, but dismantle it so that and then somebody's holding the glass jar, and somebody else is holding the foil that was on the inside, and somebody else is holding the, all the component pieces, and they're all partying and drinking and talking to each other. And much later, after many hours, they put it all back together, and then you could still shock someone with it because the component parts retained however they had built up. So they were done as party tricks, but this is
Going back to your point, though, the development of the human mind to this degree. The point is that if the human mind was sufficiently developed 30,000 years ago to come up with this art, then it would only take one person within their lifetime with the right amenities to allow them to study some aspect of physics and develop a technology.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think now in modern science, they believe, or I guess I don't know what branch of it is, but they believe that the human brain was pretty much the same as it is now for hundreds of thousands of years.
Anatomically modern for hundreds of thousands of years. Yeah.
So it's when you look at it that way, and then you consider the massive cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, it's not far-fetched that we could have had significant technological advancements far in ancient history that are just gone.
Right. That's right. And so going back to the art And the idea of, or the question of when did this take place and what caused it? Well, it could be, like you're saying, an exceptional individual. But the idea of burial practices is a little more complicated, I think, than the idea of an exceptional individual, because, and it's an interesting question, you know, but at what point do people begin to handle the dead in such a way that implies that they believe in some kind of afterlife? You know,
real quick, I do want to say the Mayan king is Pakal.
Yeah,
we were talking about very early in the very beginning of the conversation.
Right, the watcher did answer the question.
Yeah, and he didn't want us to make listeners think that he didn't get that question answered. The guy who's inside the machine, it looks like he's inside a machine with levers and stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, that's fine. So one of the concepts of the advent of the modern human mind is burial practices that sort of show that there may be a concept of an afterlife. In other words, grave goods, right? So you're not just disposing of the body anymore. Now you're doing it in some sort of reverence with symbology, with the implications that there is symbolic thinking going on in the practices of disposing of the dead. I don't know how else to put it, right? So you're doing something that shows a reverence for the end of life and the possibility of a thinking that there may be something after the end of physical life, like burying people with stuff, you know, to take with them to the afterlife, or burying them in an artful way, or with the feet always facing the rising sun, or something like that, right? These kinds of concepts of burial practices, and now there's evidence that that this is very old, very, very, very old. You know, 50, 60,000 years or more, much older than the art. And you know, and going back to the art too, there's some evidence that that art in Australia, rock art in Australia, is even older than the stuff much older than the stuff in Europe. You know, up to 70 or 80.
And about that, I mean, you have to imagine, what surface would you paint something on if you wanted to know for sure that it was going to be here 60,000 years in the future?
Right, yeah.
Or 30, or 12.
Yeah. It's got to be in a protected area that's stone, right?
Yeah. And how do you know that, you know, I mean, you just can't know. Like that protected area in stone could be under the ocean in 12,000 years.
That's right.
That protected area in stone, that dead cave, dry cave, could be a wet cave.
That's right.
In 1,000 years, and then in 3 more or 4 more thousand years, you'll never see the art.
Right.
What materials do you use to make the art? You know, it's just so.
Yeah, it's a matter of luck and
yes, and so
circumstance.
You have to realize that looking at this specific cave, like Chauvet Cave, and saying, okay, this is the oldest art ever found
in Europe.
It's actually amazing.
Yeah.
That art is still even there.
Right.
Not that people were making it, is my point.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. And yeah, that cave, that was like a well-known cave. It was on a well-known hiking trail, and people went in and out of the cave all the time. There was no art, you know, but then there was at some point, I don't really remember all the details of the story, but there were a couple of students, I think, and they went into the cave, you know, they went on a hike, they went into the cave, and they got to the back of the cave, and they were sitting down against a rock wall, and then one of them felt a little bit of a draft coming through the tumble of rocks.
Before too.
And then they eventually uncover it, and there's this whole other section of the cave that had been closed off a long time ago.
There you go.
And basically sealed the place almost hermetically. Not totally, because there was a draft coming through, but basically sealed it, and that's why that art is still there.
Yeah.
And they do it now. They seal it off now, and you know they don't let anybody in there because they're like, we have to preserve this, and to keep it preserved, you have to keep the
humidity down.
Yeah, everything
it has to be just right.
It has to be just like it has been for the past 12 or 13 or 14 or 20,000 years or whatever that kept that stuff preserved. Because yeah, you're right. If it had been open, the art would be gone.
Yeah. And that's, you know, I know jumping all over the place here, but that's why we call this place the tangent cube of science.
That's right.
Gobekli Tepe, this site in Turkey, was intentionally buried. And there's all these, you know, sort of monolithic, like pillars of limestone that have carvings, high relief, meaning the carvings are sticking out.
Yeah.
Rather than just scratched into it. They're very beautiful carvings, and they're all over these pillars. And the pillars are circular. They look like they could have been some sort of support structure for a type of roof or whatever. And there's multiple of these things. It's a huge site. They've only uncovered a tiny fragment of the number of stone circles.
And now there's evidence that there's multiple other gigantic sites just like it in other hills nearby.
Yeah, it's been dated to basically the end of the end of the Younger Dryas, so it's right at 12,000 something years old.
Yeah,
that it was buried intentionally, and so that again lends itself to number one, they were making art, beautiful art, and megalithic architecture.
Yeah,
right at this time, right after this incredibly catastrophic period, and then it was intentionally buried. And so the idea is that that's when it was made, was when it was buried. Well, to me, I look at that like, no. This was something that survived the cataclysm in whatever form. Maybe it was just the pillars that survived and they were like, we need to bury this.
Yeah.
To protect it.
Yep. And that's the reason why we still have it.
That's the only reason.
If it had not have been buried, it would have crumbled, or it would have been quarried.
Yeah, I hear that question a lot about antediluvian civilization, or what, it's not so specific, but some ancient lost civilization. Well, why don't we find their artifacts everywhere?
Yeah.
We
have.
Their artifacts are.
Yeah, and the other possibility is that we've found a lot and it's been mislabeled, right?
That's right.
This is the other question. Now this is
what we need to get into for sure.
Yeah, the concept that this is the problem. If you imagine, any place that is a habitation area, a place where people live. One of the things we've noticed just in walking around, just in hiking around our area, is that people live in the same spots.
Yes.
Right. So if for example, with us, if we're looking for arrowheads, you can find a site and you're like, this is a campsite. And then you find out you can do this by digging. And plenty of archaeology has done this as well. You dig down and you find basically layers of occupation. And as you go down, the occupation is older and older, but people have been camping on that spot for 12,000 years in a lot of cases. So then you have, for example, the city of Jericho. And it's the same thing. It's been a city or an occupation area at least back to 8 to 9,000 BC. Okay, so that means that the site is being reused by people. And if you're not careful, you can make a mistake in saying that the most recent ancient occupation are the people who built the site. And if you're not real careful to dig down and kind of go all the way down to the bottom of the occupation layer and then really date those materials if you can, and determine what is the earliest occupation and what were they doing here.
And that's the thing. Archaeology is full of this. Mm-hmm. And when you really dig into these sites and you start looking in, to the papers, the first discoverers, what they wrote, what kind of work they did, and then the next guy and the next guy, and what types of methods they used. There's so many cases where if they didn't utterly destroy evidence in the early days of archaeology, when it wasn't archaeology, it wasn't a science, so to speak. It was more like what do they call it?
What, grave robbing?
Yeah, grave robbing, which ultimately led to a badass science. They destroy a lot of stuff that you're thinking, man.
Yeah.
If only
you're like, where did that material go they dug out of that passageway? Yeah. It's just gone.
Blowing stuff up with dynamite.
Yeah.
It's just that. Anyway, when you dig into these sites, you can start to realize that, okay, there's a narrative being created here, and this is not conspiratorial necessarily. It could be in some cases, but that a narrative becomes developed. People have theories, they push the theory, and there's biases involved, and there's just a lot of questions. And you see it. Like I read a lot of science stories, archaeology stories and stuff, and it's mentioned in there that there's a lot of unknowns, but they've got their story.
Yeah.
And it's pretty well accepted. That's what we're taught in school. But when you really look deeply into many of these sites, almost every one, there are so many questions that are not answered, and so many lines of inquiry that don't make sense with the standard story.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the next thing about continuous occupation is that there's no reason to think that these more ancient peoples weren't doing the same thing, right? They're also interested in the people who lived there before
That's
them.
right, yeah.
They're also rediscovering ancient sites. There's quite clear evidence that this took place multiple times in Egypt, because, even if you're just looking at the standard model dynastic periods, that's a long, Egypt, the civilization of Egypt, of what we think of as ancient Egypt, lasted a long time, thousands of years. And they had multiple periods that where the civilization seemed to fall apart, and there'd be 100 years or 200 years, and then another dynasty would arise after that, and they'd kind of have to rebuild from the ashes and the crumbled remains of what was there before. They're still recognizably Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, but they're doing the same thing. Sites are lost, and then they're rediscovered, and then they're plundered, or maybe it's not plundering. They're pulling artifacts out, and they're relearning about their ancient past, stuff that they had forgotten. So if you're looking at, for example, the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, well, Egypt was already 2,000 years old at that point, at least. The ancient Egyptian civilization. So they have crumbling ruins around them in the deserts, and they're going out there and digging into them and finding stuff that they didn't know was there and pulling all the stuff out of it and looking at it. And so when we get in there in modern times, you have multiple periods of civilization where they have been, they build the structure, then they lose it, it crumbles, there's an earthquake, it's partially falls apart, gets covered by the desert, gets rediscovered by a less ancient civilization. They dig it all out, they rebuild the place, they put their names on it. This happens multiple times, and then we come along much later, and we're trying to decipher, well, there's a long chain of occupation here, and when it's a structure that's been rebuilt over and over and over again, it's difficult to know who the first person was that built it and how long ago that was, unless somehow the structure was completely lost and never rediscovered until we found it. And that's just very rare in a place that's been continuously occupied for the entirety of the Holocene, pretty much. So, the question about the pyramids, how old are they? Well, what's interesting about the pyramids in Giza, at the very least, is that they don't have like the kind of markings that you associate with dynastic Egyptian structures. They wrote all over their architecture, painted all over them. And the interior of these pyramids have no markings, except for the Great Pyramid has one chamber that has some painted markings on it that they consider to be mason's marks. But there's questions about that.
That's sketchy.
Yeah. How old is the paint? There's some evidence that it has been dated, and but you can't find any, did they take samples and date the paint to find out, is it recent? Is it modern? How old is the paint? And there's no information on that. Why wouldn't they date the paint? Well, maybe they did, and they found out that it's only a few hundred years old, and that means that it doesn't answer who built the pyramid, because right now they use those marks in there to say, well, Khufu built this pyramid, because one of the marks is supposedly his cartouche, his name. Nowhere else in the pyramid is it written that he built it. And there's not any, there's not a lot, there's no documents in Egypt of them building those pyramids. There's a whole bunch of stuff like this.
That's another rabbit hole entrance.
Yeah.
Which is, there is not a single original burial that has ever been discovered in any pyramid in Egypt.
Yeah, that's right. The mastabas have some, but these big pyramids, they don't.
Not one.
Yeah.
So the idea that these are tombs is a hypothesis.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah. It's the idea that it's a gigantic...
And they do the same thing for Central American pyramids.
Right.
It's the same deal.
Yeah.
They're all tombs, yet no mummies, no original burial has ever
Yeah.
been found in any of them.
Yeah. And there is evidence, especially with the Central and South American stuff, that these modern or these structures that we see on them that we equivalent, like the Mayan pyramids, they're built on more ancient structures that were there previously. This is also the case in Egypt. How many times have these sites been built on? And when you have continuous occupation, how many times has the same site been built on top of by each successive civilization? And how do you track that down? It's very difficult. It becomes muddled. Like in modern times, you have urban exploration, and they do this. You go to a modern city, it may only be a couple hundred years old. It's got stuff underground that people haven't seen in 100 years.
Yeah. The pyramids in Mexico were covered in jungle, basically dirt.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, they were excavated.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're huge.
Right.
That's mind blowing in and of itself.
Right.
There's, I think, is the Pyramid of the Sun. I can't remember which one exactly, but when they were doing the excavations, they ended up like digging into the wall of the pyramid itself. A lot of the original surface was destroyed.
Yep.
They were pulling huge sheets of mica.
Yeah.
Out of these structures.
Yeah, that's it.
And selling it.
Teotihuacan. Yeah.
There's been liquid mercury found underneath these things.
Yep.
There's so much stuff in there. You're like, what? What does this have to do with a tomb?
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's. I mean, the Ancient Aliens, like, especially the TV show, that this is like some weird like landing sites for UFOs or whatever. I don't think that that's the case, but I don't think it's necessary to bring in aliens to explain any of the building of these things. But we follow the work of Chris Dunn. He's an engineer and looks into the basic idea that form follows function, right? As an engineer.
Yeah.
And in many cases, there are high precision artifacts that can't be made by the human hand without machine assistance. It doesn't mean a computerized machine necessarily, but you have to have something that gives you the same arc or curve over and over again, exactly the same, which would mean mechanical devices to cut stone. The inclusion of these very specific materials lends credence to the idea that they were functional in some way.
Yeah.
Whereas the standard model of archaeology looks at these structures and almost every one is going to be a tomb or a temple.
Right. Ceremonial in some fashion.
Ceremonial.
Yeah.
This is all these people, all these ancient butt flappers were just religious zealots, and they were building amazing architecture just because of some crazy beliefs that they had that are just total BS.
Yeah. Or because they were ruled by this king that they thought was a god or something.
Yeah. And so and it's sort of, I don't know. To me, I see it as it's insulting.
Yeah.
To the ancient people, whoever they were, who built this stuff. It's like it's a weird form of like, hey, check out this story that they all thought was true, and that's why they did all this crazy shit.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of these structures are aligned astronomically, which is another interesting factor. And this is, this is more accepted today than it was when I first started looking into this. But it's gradually more and more accepted that a lot of these structures, that they paid attention to astronomy and they aligned them in some way. That's also considered to be ceremonial, But when you're doing very specific alignments, like when we went to Mesa Verde and we were looking at some of the Pueblo culture there.
Yeah.
And they had alignments to things that are very specific and strange, like the moon wobble. What is it? The maximum and
it's the
major and minor something, lunar oscillation, something like that.
I just added on. The major lunar standstill, major and minor lunar standstill.
That's right. The very tiny movement of the moon in the sky.
18.6-year cycle or something like that.
Yeah, and they also aligned one entire wall of to a supernova that took place.
The Crab Nebula.
Yeah.
And they witnessed this supernova.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're obviously observing the skies, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're building and so it's like, I mean, it's just us. It's just people just like us looking at the universe, wondering how everything works and studying it.
Yeah.
And working it out.
Right.
You know, they noticed that these two natural pillars that were left over from a gigantic flood at the end of the Ice Age on top of this mountain that had a gap between them, that from a certain vantage point, the moon rose between the full moon rose between those two pillars right at moonrise, right at its standstill position, which takes place every 18.6 years. Someone noticed that.
Yeah.
Or they predicted it based on previous observations, right?
Yeah, right.
In whatever case, they carried stones up to the top of this mountain because the stones that they needed were not available at the top of the mountain. And so they carried all these stones up there, apparently without pack animals. They carried gigantic logs up there.
Yeah, trees.
And the trek to the top of this mountain is like steep, and it's very narrow because it's falling off on both sides.
Yep.
And so this was a major undertaking. They were planting maize, corn, like these tiny little corns and stuff.
Yep.
And you know, there's extremely cold winters.
Yeah, and yet they built this big structure up there in the right spot to watch the moon stand still between those two natural pillars.
And, you know, while we're at it, remember that supernova we saw a couple
let's
years
just
ago?
align
Let's
this
make
whole
this wall
wall
aligned to that
point
thing.
to that thing, yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, it was all religious, right? This was, you know, it was part of their religious ceremonies. It's like, no, I don't think so.
Right.
I think that word is not the proper word to describe their reasoning behind
it. It's like calling a modern astronomical observatory like a religious temple. It's like, oh, this is a religious rite. They're worshiping the stars. No, that's not what they're doing in that thing.
But in a way, when you start looking into the vagaries of language, this is what you can easily arrive at.
Right.
Especially if you have, like we try to do this a lot, where you imagine yourself in the future after a cataclysm and having lost all this modern technology that we have, and what you're describing to your kids or your grandkids or your great-grandkids.
Yeah.
Who are now 1 or 2 or 3 generations removed from that civilization. So their dad or their grandfather grew up without that, and you still remember it.
Yeah.
So they would have no concept for understanding this type of thing, and you're trying to describe to them how we had these things that fly around. You can't say space. That doesn't mean anything to them. It was up there with the stars, and it circles the, you know, the land that we're on. And we could send, like, I have this tablet. It's about, you know, it kind of looks like that piece of slate you got there, and you could write, or, you know, you come up with something to say, and you can use that thing, and it sends it up there, and then it comes back down somewhere else, and that other person can get what you said, and to them it's like, this is magic, like you know, so it's
well, how did it send the message? Well, there are these invisible, like,
waves of energy,
it just signals that
Well, you can't even use the word energy.
You can't use, well, how do you describe this to somebody who doesn't have any of these concepts? And so you can easily imagine how the stories that are being told by the people who survived the cataclysm and remember the civilization very quickly become generalized in such a way.
Because our languages are dedicated to the worlds we live in.
That's right.
We have so much in our language today that 30 years ago we didn't have, because of the rise of the internet and computer technology and that type of communication. You could, if you went back 30 years and tried to describe to somebody what you were doing yesterday, it wouldn't make any sense to them.
Yeah, that's right.
You would have to then describe so much stuff just to give them the basic concept, or you just have to change the words to make it match the world that they lived in.
Yeah.
And this is what it looks like. So thousands of years down the line, we receive this story that was received by somebody else, that was received by somebody else, and so on and so on and so on, all the way back to the person who maybe originally told it.
Yeah.
And it is, this,
text is one of these words. Like that used to mean like print on paper. But the way people use it now, it means a message sent to me over my phone.
Yeah.
Right? It's still words, but like I remember the first time I heard the word texted. I think the Watcher was the first one who said that to me. He's like, "Ooh, I'm getting texted." I was like, I had never heard that word turned into a verb before.
Texted it.
Texting,
Yeah.
Yeah, that was not like, handing somebody a piece of paper with a message written on it was not called texting. This is something that happened. This is a very recent adaptation,
Yeah, so you take these translations of, say, these, like the book of what is in the Duat or whatever, the book of the dead.
Yeah.
Where it's talking about, you go to the underworld and you do all this stuff and then you become a star or something, there's all this weird stuff about going up into the heavens and becoming, just all of the stuff about going up into the heavens.
Yeah.
Is now considered all religious, it's just belief systems.
Yep.
But if we were trying to describe that in the future, like, well, yeah, they went up into the heavens.
Yeah.
And
there were these specific heroes that were picked out by the civilization, and they went up into the heavens and became a star that we could all see moving through the sky.
Right. They became a star. That's right. The satellite.
Yeah.
Or the
space
station.
Yeah.
And they went up in a giant chariot of fire.
That's right.
So there is
we call this quant suff.
Yes, that's right.
That's our term. That was
Tell the story.
It was gotten from an old science fiction called "The Star's My Destination," and the basic idea is that scientific terms can be the original meaning can be lost, but people can still use them in ritualistic settings. And should I tell the whole concept here? Like that? Yeah. So
give this.
There was a scientific
some context.
in the science fiction story, there was a scientific expedition, a spaceship full of scientists who were going out to do some specific experiment, long-term experiment or whatever. But their ship crashed or they lost power or something, and they ended up stuck on an asteroid with just the fragments of their ship, and they couldn't get back. And they were stuck there with no way to the rest of the civilization. The ship was just lost. It just vanished without a trace. But they survived, and they had kids, and those kids had kids, and multiple generations down the line, people in the science fiction story encounter this group of people who are now multiple generations extended from these original ancestors who were scientists. So the ship was full of scientific instruments and texts, books and documents, and that's what they have, right? So these people who are like the great-great-great-grandchildren of scientists, they don't know any science anymore. They've completely lost all their science, but they have all these texts and all these, all these instruments that don't work anymore. And they've built an entire religion based on these ancient texts that they've got. Okay. And so they read these in the science. It was kind of done in a comedic kind of way in the science fiction story, but these people would read these scientific documents like religious texts and use them as prayers and stuff like that. And one of the ones that they would read over and over was it was like a chemical formula or a method for doing some chemical procedure.
Whatever, yeah.
And at the end, the last phrase on there was the abbreviation quant suff, which stands for quantity sufficient. But they used the word the phrase quant suff to mean amen. That was the end of the prayer that they had read from the document, right? And they had so there were all these distortions of things that you would recognize when the characters in there are interacting with these people. They had a marriage ceremony, and they were like the whole like something blue, something new, whatever what is that you do with the marriage ceremony? I think we went through this before. It's like
I can't remember.
It's like you have something new and something true and something blue, whatever.
Yeah.
And but they did it as inoculations. in that because they're merging it in some weird way with scientific procedures. So the girl that he's being forced to marry, the character is being forced to marry this girl who's one of the descendants of these. She's got like these marks on her arm, and she's like, I've been inoculated with something blue and something, but it's actually this weird, it's just a phrase of her being married. Something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. Thank you, Watcher. That's the phrase, right? But they actually gave her shots with that stuff into her arm, and it's all infected, and he's like, oh, what is going on here, right? It's like so, yeah, we use the term quant stuff to mean
any ancient practice or idea that has been lost and sort of given new meaning.
Yeah.
That is more mystical.
Right. Yeah. They're continuing on some kind of practice that originally had its basis in science. But they've lost so much knowledge that they don't even remember science itself and have no way of understanding the things that they're doing in ritual at this point.
That's right.
So there are some things when you're reading through ancient texts or whatever, and you see something, you're like, man, that looks like quant stuff medical information, right? Yeah. Where it's like the people who are writing the text down have no advanced medical knowledge, and yet it looks like they were being given instruction or are recalling instruction from either documents or being given that stuff from a person who does have advanced medical knowledge and is trying to explain in very simple terms to somebody who has a language that doesn't contain the scientific jargon necessary to explain the concept. So they're just like, look, this is what you have to do. Don't put any of the dead bodies near the water.
Yeah.
Right. And there's no explanation for why, and the person writing the text down clearly doesn't know why they do it, but they do it because it's ritual. Right. And so the idea that you're ritualizing something that has a basis in science is, this is not a totally strange phenomenon. Like the idea of not eating pork is one of these. Like the idea,
trichinosis.
Right. Yeah. It can kill you if the proper precautions aren't taken. So the idea to put it into a religious setting so that people will just follow it without asking for a further explanation, because they don't require one, because it's like, well, God said don't do this, so I'm not going to do it. Right. That's quant stuff. And it's an interesting.
It's a very useful.
Yeah,
it is, because it can be a difficult concept to describe, as you just did. But once you have that in your mind, you're looking at these whatever rituals, or you're reading ancient texts, you can see it and you're like, quant stuff.
Yeah. So I always give that explanation from the old sci-fi story, The Stars My Destination. But one we came up with that gives once you've heard that story, now you can sort of try to imagine this happening in the future, right? So let's say our civilization falls, and a couple of 100 years from now, there are, many generations down the line, there are people that are kind of inhabiting the ruins of our civilization. Most of the ruins are completely gone or whatever, but there might be some old rusting, hulks of cars spread around. And so they might get, ritualistically all climb into the car and go through the motions of like, you have to buckle your belt. And then they all act like they're going somewhere. They have this knowledge that like, oh yes, now we turned the key and then we're going somewhere. And they all do it in their minds, right? It's a ritual, but that ritual is, to somebody who knows what to look for, is actually talking about something that used to actually physically take place with science, as opposed to now these people are like, yes, I can feel it moving, we're going somewhere different, and it's all happening in their heads.
Yeah. And then after that, they take the stone tablet outside to receive reception.
That's right. So they can talk to each other. That's right.
So they can talk to their ancestors through the sky.
That's right. So they can call upon the Google.
He of many numbers.
That's right. The great God Google. The master of all knowledge and advertisements. All right.
So not only is there very interesting numbers embedded in the ancient text, but when you start looking at the Great Pyramid,
yep,
there are many very interesting numbers embedded in that structure.
Yeah.
In so many ways that are basically the same. It's like pointing to many of the same types of things. Like there are processional numbers in that structure.
Yeah.
And
pi and phi.
Yes.
Transcendental numbers that are buried into the architecture of it. Possibly the speed of light. Squaring the circle. All kinds of very interesting and strange and mathematical and geometric
fundamental things.
Functions. Yes, fundamental things. And also things about the size of the Earth. That's
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So what I was going into is that I know somewhere Randall has a really good lecture online about this type of thing. I don't know which one, but it's getting into the number systems.
Probably on Geocosmic Rex.
Yeah. Getting into the number systems, measurement, using the inch, the foot, the mile, and how that correlates with the human body, how it correlates with the measurement of time and geometry, 360 degrees in a circle, dividing those into the minutes and seconds of degrees of arc, or minutes and the second minute. And that is a whole nother type of system that is not tangible, but it is very old and we don't know its origin.
Yeah.
Okay. So
right.
This system of dividing the circle into 360 parts, and then dividing each one of those parts into 60 parts, and then dividing each one of those parts into 60 more parts.
Yeah.
Is a very interesting system. It is the way we measure time in the same manner. And of course, time is sort of, the markers of the passage of time are the heavens.
Yeah.
The motions in the heavens. And of course, we're moving in circles around the sun. And so it makes perfect sense. So let's divide the circle into a number that is divisible by the most possible numbers we can imagine, so we can evenly divide it.
Yeah.
And once you do that, and now you're able to sort of divide the great circle that we move around the sun in. Well, then you can divide Earth's third motion, which is the axial wobble, possibly into using those same numbers, and then you develop a system of linear or spatial measurement utilizing the human body and the proportions of the human body, which also are, by nature, they have things like phi and stuff embedded into our bodies. And so like the development of the empirical measurement system and how it correlates to the time and space.
Imperial,
I'm sorry. It hasn't.
Empirical is probably how they came about. But
it hasn't destroyed any other measurement systems yet.
Right.
So I know. Well, empirical is
empirical as in like the pursuit of data.
Yeah.
This is yeah. So they empirically generated the imperial measurement system.
That's right. That's another thing that happens on this podcast is say a lot of stupid stuff. Anyway,
it wasn't stupid. It's just wrong word. That's.
So the way that those two systems, geometry, the measurement of the Earth, geometry, the measurement of time, and the how they all correlate and how you can apply these systems to some of these ancient structures. Yeah. Like the Great Pyramid, and arrive at very interesting mathematical constants or weird stuff like that.
That's right.
And it's like it begs the question: who came up with this system? Yeah, because
how
it's
old is it?
Old that it's almost embedded in the measurement system itself. The measurement system itself implies knowledge of the cosmos in ways that we would not even. I mean, the distance from Earth to the sun, the distance from Earth to the moon, and all of these other things that it is just like, okay.
Knowledge of the difference in the sizes of the Earth, the moon and the sun, and it's just, it's like.
It's incredible.
Seeing these ratios built into some of these structures.
Very high degree of mathematical understanding to just come up with a system
Right. And Randall also points out these, the etymology of the word temple. You have temple, tempo, temporal. The idea that so you're using sacred geometry, which is specifically geometric concepts, principles, and numbers that are built into nature that you can discover by empirical study.
That's right.
And then the concept of so those concepts, which are you don't have to have things moving around to see them. Like the size of the Earth is a thing. It's geometric, and the differences between the distance from here to here and there to there, those are geometric things. And then there's the geometry of various shapes that are like the Platonic solids. These shapes that are built into nature all over the place and are fundamental. Those things are in temples, but then there's also alignments to vast astronomical cycles and small ones too, like the year or the rotation of the planet itself. So those things are comprised of both the geometry that's built into nature, the sacred geometry, and time. Like you can't see the cycle without the passage of time. So the idea of a temple being a record of the geometries of nature and the passage of time.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
And that completely changes your whole concept of temple itself, right? You're like, okay, now I can see why these temples, rather than being places where people were just running in there and worshiping things that don't exist based on stories
next to the god so it'll rot.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Worshiping things that don't exist based on stories that aren't real. Instead, what they are like studies in stone of the nature of the universe and the passage of time. And that's really where, and then you start to ask yourself, how old is this?
Yeah. Where did this come from? Because like when you start to just taking the simple act of dividing the circle into 360 parts, degrees, right? That thing, if you start with that number, then you end up as you're studying geometry. Let's say you make your equilateral triangle, you make your square, you make your cube. You start to develop these the Platonic solids, and you start to measure the angles built into these Platonic solids. You end up with precessional numbers.
Yeah,
every single one of them is a precessional number.
Yeah,
2160, 4300 or 43,200.
Yeah,
25,920.
Yep.
It's you get all these numbers, and 108.
Yeah.
But if you didn't divide the circle into 360 parts, you wouldn't get those numbers. And those numbers are the number of years of the passage of, how many times the Earth goes around the sun before the axial wobble changes 30 degrees.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
And so it's like,
who did this math?
Who did this? They already knew about precession.
Yeah.
When they came up with this number system, and they decided to incorporate it into the number system to measure geometry, for geometry.
Yeah.
But I mean, the name of that geometry itself implies that this is, they're like, this is what this is all about.
Right.
So you pick the best numbers, and then we end up, that's what we use, and it's been used as far back as we know. And
and then there's the, when you, I know we're probably getting up on time here, but like the idea of calendars, right? You can look at calendars and ancient peoples, like it's familiar to a lot of people that the Mayans were, masters of the calendar. Like it's in some cases, it looks like they're astronomical, and their time, their calendars itself were far more advanced than the evidence that we see of their civilization itself. It seems to like it's a strange outlier. Like their calendar science was way more advanced than anything they needed for the rest of their civilization.
And the narrative is just like, oh, well, they were just, it was part of their religion, and they were obsessed with the, it's like that.
But they had the concepts of time that they have built into their calendars, like these gigantic, enormous spans of time that are completely unnecessary for, an agrarian, whatever, an agricultural civilization that otherwise didn't have a whole lot of advancements. And then you have things like the Vedic texts and stuff like that, where they're showing you these tiny, tiny fragments of time where you're like, they don't need, who needs a division of time so small that no human can possibly.
We do.
Yeah, we need it for our high technology.
That's right.
Because we measure things in tiny, tiny fragments of time because of technology. So that's the question is like, you see things like little nuggets like that where some knowledge is being passed down, and it's clear now, most anthropologists and archaeologists accept that the Mayans' calendar is something they inherited from an older civilization.
Yeah.
That those and then when we go to Egypt, we see it in structures, certain artifacts in stone. And then in places like, down in South America, we see it also in stone, that there are these little hints of high technology in deep antiquity that are the only fragments left of either one or many civilizations that are far older than anything we consider that's in the standard model of archaeology today. Gobekli Tepe is the only solid known thing now that's that old that shows this kind of this kind of megalithic building or whatever. Now I don't know how precise the site of Gobekli Tepe is in terms of
honestly it looks hand done. I mean,
yeah, it does.
Kind of the way it looks.
It does. So are there other types of precision built in? I don't know. People have, it's relatively new. People are questioning, like, is it astronomically aligned? What do these symbols mean? Are they constellations? Were they measuring the passage of time somehow with these circles? It's not clear, but it's things like this. And then also ancient maps where they had the longitude right. Longitude is a very difficult thing to do. We only got it right in the late 1800s,
Yep.
And to be
very easy thing to do when you have machines.
Right. Once you've got a proper timepiece that you can take onto a ship, a watch, basically.
And machining is a very useful tool when you need to make a very accurate timepiece.
Right. So why are there ancient maps with very precise longitude markers of place? It's very interesting. So there are these little nuggets that point to the possibility. And then, another thing to look at is Hamlet's mill. This concept of this millstone that is in all these ancient stories. Something's spinning, turning very slowly, and the stories are so ancient that they can't even be traced. The authors put it as they disappear into the mists of antiquity. The stories themselves do, and they all have this imagery of this gigantic, very slowly turning stone, which is probably talking about the precession of the equinoxes, which takes 25,920 years to complete. A very slow turning circle.
Yep.
So that's Hamlet's mill. The millstone of the gods grinds very fine and slowly, right? It's like it takes forever for it to do it. And yet it seems like ancient people in very distant times were already aware of these gigantic cycles and numbers, like Kyle was saying, when they seem to pop into being out of nowhere and start building giant civilizations in 4000 BC.
Yep.
So that's what we look at on this podcast. And, a lot of it is speculation. We throw out crazy ideas and laugh them off and shoot them down almost immediately.
Send us your ideas. We'll shoot them down.
That's right. That's right. So there you go. I don't know if that was any more helpful than the last time we did this, but it sure was fun.
The old rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yeah, we've come to decide that there's only one rabbit hole because all rabbit holes you decide to go down into seem to connect to each other, which means there's only one rabbit hole, which means that one rabbit has been really busy. Incredibly busy one rabbit because all these rabbit holes are connected somehow.
Yep.
And so we didn't even touch on the modern.
We didn't even scratch the surface of the rabbit hole, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, there's UFOs, missing people, other.
I know.
Other
I was pretty sure I was going to be going all UFO and on this rabbit hole.
Yeah, what it comes down to is you don't need aliens to have built these ancient structures. We're more interested in a much more ancient, advanced human civilization.
Definitely interested in that, but also interested in the possibility of aliens and whether we are being visited and whether we have in the past. I mean, it's all interesting stuff. Is it necessary to explain the ancient monuments that we have? No.
Nope. But do we have unexplained phenomena in our skies? Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say something else. Damn. Just lost it with the old aliens thing. Yeah. Okay. The concept of these eyes. We talk about this too.
Oh, yeah.
And you should check out the glossary of terms on the website.
Yep.
These eyes are basically after, just continuing to go down the path of digging into various rabbit holes. You learn you get some tidbit of information, right? You're like, you make a connection. And then you find out later, when you're looking back at something you already looked into, you realize that new piece of information you discovered weeks ago or whatever connects and it provides another possible solution.
Yeah, opens new doorways and possibilities.
New doorways of inquiry.
And stuff you'd already gone through and looked at and
spent tons of time digging into. Yeah. So it's and that's another reason why this is always a continuing conversation. It doesn't matter. We did episodes on subjects years ago, and we could do them again, and we'd have a different take because you constantly learning and seeing things in new ways. So
that's right. All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. That was a lot of fun.
It was fun.
So you can get a hold of us, brothersoftheserpent@gmail.com, and check out the website, brothersoftheserpent.com. Kyle just mentioned it. It has lots of stuff there. All the podcast-related stuff, including the encyclopedia and the glossary. Also the snake skins, which is our merchandise store. So if you guys want to support the show that way, you can get t-shirts and other cool swag. There's also the pyramid scheme, which is how you can support the show monetarily. So if you like the show and you feel like it gives you some value, then you can give us some value back however much you want. There's Patreon. There's also a PayPal donate button there for one-time donations. If you join the Patreon, we do have Patreon content. So we have just recently started adding stuff, and that's been fun. So yeah, if you join the Patreon, you get a special Patreon feed. What you got?
I was just going to say that if you do a one-time donation to the PayPal in the amount of $50 or more, we give you producer credit for the show.
That's right. That's right. And give us reviews wherever you can. And thanks for the reviews that have been coming in. I was seeing that.
And I will read your name in full unless you tell me not to. Give me an alias so I can read something.
Or say anonymous. Yeah, that's right. And I've been seeing the review. I could tell people listen to the back catalog because they're like, too much laughing, 5 stars. It's hilarious. Thank you so much. And we're on Twitter, so follow us there at Snake Bros with no vowels, SNKBRS. There's a Facebook group if you want to join that. There's also a Discord chat. So on the website, there's a connect button to the Discord. Lots of other Snake Bros, the Snake Force is in there, and you can talk to them. People are always having great conversations in there about all these mysteries and more, way more than we could ever possibly talk about on the show. So join the Discord if you want to talk to like-minded people about these kinds of things.
No politics.
Yeah, no politics, no porn. Be nice in the chats. There's also,
or I'll give you the boot.
That's right. Kyle will kick you out. He's no mercy. We also have the Library of the Serpent. So that's run by Jeff. He's constantly updating it, adding things to it. That's lots of documents and other things that are in the public domain, and then also links to buy books that we talk about on the show and or relate to topics that we talk about on the show. And thanks to History Shift. He makes all of our YouTube videos. So thanks so much to him. And all of you listeners out there, we love you guys.
Always have.
Always will.
I've never banned anybody from the Discord. Just kicked them out.
That's right.
Come back with a new attitude. Love you.
Yeah.
Always have, always will.
Good night, Adamu.
Turn it up, Scotty.